Beginner guide to using React hooks. We in the last tutorial we were talking about class components and state, how to handle events and user input. We went through the style of class components, which was React 16.8 prior to React 16.8. We know with class components there is a reason for them because traditionally they are stateful, whereas functional components out of the box are stateless. We went through the class component syntax. We know there's a little bit more setup involved, and wouldn't it be nice to be able to take a functional component and give it some state? So after 16.8 in React, they allowed for this type of scenario using React hooks. And what we want to do is create a functional component that matches this class one I just created. So I have a class component here that all it does is it tracks internal state, updating the React DOM to re-render the dev tree, the document object model tree. So let's do that. So I already created this project with npx create React app CRA. I already created a simple class component counter. What we want to do, and I have two components because I want to talk about two hooks today. I want to create the same type of functional component. So I already have a functional class, and I'll just call this guy counter FC for functional component. And we'll go into here and we'll start to build this guy out a little bit. What we need to do first is we need to import from React. So we need to actually call out that we're going to import from React. Once we've done that, then it's just a function, a JavaScript function. But the difference is it's Pascal case, meaning it starts with a capital, and React sees that type of function. It'll expect at the very least that you will return some type of JSX. And you can export this in this way here, export default, counter FC. And make sure you actually spell it correctly. So there's my little tiny functional component. It's static. It doesn't return anything right now. If I go back to my app.js, my entry, I need to import this counter FC. You can see it there. And I'll suggest if I hit return, it should fill out the path to it. And then inside of my my outgoing JSX, I need to just reference that new component via its tag. And the UI is not great, but I can certainly see there that my component is being rendered. So what I would like to do now is give this some state to my functional component. How you do that is from React, we can use destructuring, which is the braces, to just pull out a hook called useState. And useState is actually a pretty nice little hook. And we'll review the class component syntax in just a little bit. Usually with useState, it usually gives you two values that you can pull out of it. This is array destructuring. It gives you the value that you want to keep in state and a way to increment that value. And you just need to set up useState and give it a default. So I know this will be a number, so I'll default it to 0. And all that does is the pattern is always going to be value and then set value. And those, it can be anything. It can be data and set data. It's just a way to sync up the state as it's being updated. So now I have this mechanism for state. I've defaulted it, which is great. We'll compare it against a class component in just a second. So what we need to do now is just track. We need to output at the very least. So I'll just keep this little header just so we know where we are, and I'll wrap it inside of a header tag. And then I'll just put my JSX just on kind of a new line just to make it a little bit better. And then inside of here, maybe I will give a paragraph tag, and I'll just output the value of count. And we need to wrap it in those braces just so we can see it. Go back to our output. We can see here counter FC. We can see here that this component is tracking its own internal count, which is different from ours, which is good because that's what we want. We'll create a button, and inside the button will be just increment, will be the text. Just quickly go and see that that is the case here. You can see here there is no state being updated. So what next is we need to add a handler. So usually an event handler, and we can do this two ways. We can either nicely create a handler for handle click, which is a function that does not receive a variable. You know behind the scenes that it's an event-driven action, and it always has an event that comes along for the ride. But we don't need to reference that right now because we're not doing anything with it. Inside of this handle click, I mean, we could at least put we could put an alert up just quickly to say that clicked, just so we know that it's working. And we could then, from inside the button, add our on-click handler. We need to add it camel-cased. So the first word is lowercase followed by the first capitalization of the next word. That's kind of React style. And in here, we can just reference handle click. And we need to wrap it inside those braces just so that it is wired up correctly. It is kind of wired. It's wired up by reference, meaning it will only fire when somebody clicks. If I invoke it right away like this, it'll fire once and then never again will it be able to be clicked, right? So we can see it fired and then it goes dead. We looked at this when we were dealing with input and events. So now by reference, when I click it, it works. So we have that event handler working. So we don't need this anymore. We know that's working. We can then just simply set count to, we want to set count to, we can do count plus 1. Go back and we can see that's tracking now. So what's happening in the DOM, if we were to inspect with our dev tools and we were to just look at this 10 here, sorry, if we go back here, we can see this, use our dev tools again and grab this block. You can see as I'm clicking, React is smart enough just to update that node there. You can see that is due to the virtual DOM and React being smart enough to only render what needs to be changed. And I'm sure if we were to inspect this other counter as well, we could see that 16 is being updated as well. Just note, I mean, I like to kind of put the functions, it's more clear and declarative when the functions are kind of isolated and you can kind of step through them, but you can certainly do it this way. You can certainly kind of wrap kind of an anonymous function, they call it, inline, where it does that one increment. Now this only works when it's a very straightforward function, meaning one line. Usually you don't need to wrap everything in a curly brace. However, if it gets more involved than that, it's better to just create, like when there's more logic and this needs to be, many lines of code, it's better to take it out because you can step through it more and it's more clear. But for something as simple as this, you can do it inline. This kind of callback is called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a named function. There's no name to it, whereas this is a named function. In fact, it's actually called a named functional expression because just of the way, just kind of JavaScript background, the way it's kind of assigned. There's another way to do it where you kind of add the keyword function and then you do it in this fashion. But this is ES6 syntax with the arrow, the thick arrow. But anyhow, like I was trying to get to, we still have state in our functional component. So useState works pretty well, pretty useful hook. Compare this quickly to what this would look like in a class component. So I have this counter here, and first off, you can see it's kind of set up the same as a handle click method. Where we do the set count, and use state, in a class component, you need to set that up in the constructor. That's kind of like the initializer. And then you need to worry about this dot state. This keyword corresponds to the class. This instance of a class, it is all being inherited from React.component. So you can see here the class component has a class keyword extend. You need a constructor. You need to worry about the super, which is the super component, the parent. You need to worry about the this keyword. The render is kind of a method, so it kind of looks different. And you can see the output. The output is the same, but you're dealing with this .state.count, and you need to wire up this .handle click. Handle click, and this is how, instead of using just straight set count in a very simple way, set count, you need to use the this.setState method that comes from React components. And inside of this .state, you need to then, increment the count. And this is kind of showing a pattern of how to preserve the previous state and increment it. So there's a lot more to do in a class component, and just by comparing them, look at how many lines this is here, 20, 27, 28 lines comparison to if we really tidied this up. To be honest, it's a lot shorter. It would be half of that perhaps. So I mean, it's just much cleaner and more straightforward. Plus, you can actually test this a lot more easier because it's a JavaScript function. The next component I wanted to look at, which is really useful, is called the useEffect hook. The useEffect hook allows you to hook into lifecycle of a component. Traditionally, the classical functional component is just a function. It doesn't have lifecycle. We would often use a class component to hook into when the component loaded or mounted and make some well-timed calls or logic. One example is if we were using something like this, JSON placeholder tippy code, which is pretty much just a fake API. And if you look at the URL, JSON placeholder tippy code /post, my browser is making a web request. And the web request is just a GET request for this data. Looking at the network tab, you'll see if I refresh this, if I click into the fetch, there should be, if I filter post, let's make a web, let's refresh this. It's buried in here somewhere, logs, post. In fact, this is we'll probably see this better when I actually do it from my own app. So let's take a look at my own app and do the same thing. Clear out. This component is going to be, there you can see post right there. So you see the post is calling JSON placeholder tippy code /post. It's making a fetch or a GET request, and the response is that entire payload that we just looked at. So this is a class component. It is making that web service call. What it's using under the hood is the fetch API. And you can always look this up from the documents online. It's global to your browser. It's understood. And it kind of shows you how it goes about and makes those calls. The syntax is really just this: await fetch. You give it the URL, and then you need to step through it. Syntax is showing async await, but promises can also be used as well. But just know it's built into the browser. So this is a class component. We'll look at that again after we've written our component. So right now, we just want to create our own functional component. We'll call it fetch.jsx, and we'll set it up in the same way. We'll import React. But right now, we want to grab the useState hook, which we talked about for giving us state. And this new hook is called useEffect, which is going to give us a lifecycle hook. And we want to pull this out of React. So we have that all set up. we create our function. Now we can create our functional component like we did before in this manner, right? We can do it like this and then export it if we wanted to. Export by default fetch. I mean, you'll often see that pattern. However, we could also do it in this manner as well. We could do it in that functional expression, they call it. And it's really just giving an anonymous function and naming it. And directly, you could honestly directly export this right out. And then that still works. And we're expecting obviously for our function to return something, and we can return just a fragment if we wanted to. Fragment is just an empty node, empty tag in the DOM, but it needs to act as a container for our JSX needs a container tag to host everything. You cannot have adjacent tags. So let's look at this here. We imported posts and we have fetch now, and we're using our autocomplete to pull that in. And what we need to do here is just we will just kind of offload this class component because there's a lot of data in there, and just make sure that's rendering properly. So there's our post. What we want to do first now is we can set up our hook for data. So we'll use our useState. We have data and we have the way to set data, and we are going to give it a default. We're going to use useState, and we're going to give it a default of an empty array. So that is data is a variable. We could use it, and what we want to do in our JSX is we would like to iterate over the array because we imagine it will be filled up at some time, and we want to create a fragment and output it. So one of the best ways to do it is create an unordered list, a UL, and then we can, because we want an LI, but what we want is all the items, and we want it to be dynamic for every item in our data set. It needs to render out this LI, and the LI would have the item value. So we need a mechanism to do that. One way we could do it is using the JavaScript mapping method for arrays. Array map, protect map. If you look at this docs, it'll show you exactly what we would like to do. You have an array. Ours will be an array of data. It'll iterate over through it. Usually it transforms it and produces a new array. So this is timesing everything by 2 and then outputting a new array. That is the result of that. We would like to iterate over all of our data points, and our new array will be an array of fragments, JSS fragments, even if it is just wrapped inline, it is still a new list that will be rendered. So let's use the array map, and we can set this up. So we'll remove this guy here. In order to make that mapping mechanism work, we need to wrap everything in the curly braces. We have data.map. It is a call. It requires a callback function. So we give it a callback function, and we'll put an arrow. Like I said, I'm doing this inline. I could take this function out and create a named function or a functional expression called render data that does the same thing and plug it in here, but we're just doing it inline because you'll see that pattern quite a bit. But it is a lot of curly braces to take care of. So now each time this is mapping through, it'll give us an item or data point, whatever we want to call it. So that item will be available to us. And all we're going to do here is just have that LI being mapped out, and we will have item.title, I believe, because we are, and we can look at the data set. If we look at the data set, you can see here, it's an array of objects, key value pairs, user ID and number. And you can see here there is a key for title, and that's the value. So when we're dealing with the object or the item, in that form, we need to use the dot notation to inspect all of the properties or the keys. So we could certainly do more than just showing the title. We could show all of these if we created a fragment or a paragraph for each, or however we would do it. We could output all of it if we wanted to. But for right now, I'm just after the title, I mean, we could be nice and then create a key for this just to satisfy some valid HTML messages here. So I mean, like usually React likes when you add keys, so there's an ID available to us. So I'm just going to put that as part of the markup. It's not required though. Go back to our post, and you can see nothing is happening because we haven't made a call to fetch anything. And we could create a handler method to fetch data, and it can be an arrow function. And this is where we're going to use the fetch API. We don't need to do anything aside from just give it fetch. And fetch is going to say, where do you want to, what URL would you like? And then it's going to return a promise back. So I would like to call this post. That is where I would like to fetch from. So I'll pluck that in there, and then that'll return a promise object or an asynchronous object we could await on. But we know about promises has the two paths, the success and the failure. The success comes through the thenable, and it will give us a callback to handle the response. And the response could just be response .json. Now this is the one drawback to the fetch API is, and Axios does this for us. We need to kind of dig into this twice, meaning the response comes back as kind of an unformatted payload. What we're doing here is we're taking the response and we're saying, give us the JSON, give us the JSON from the JSON data format from the response. That kind of comes out as a promise as well. So then you need to do a double thenable or chain them so that you get the actual data out of it. It's kind of a drawback if you don't like promises too much, but that will give us all of our data returned. So that should fetch for us. Now we could say, all right, well, I'm going to, when this component renders, I'm going to fetch all of that data. So I'm going to invoke it, and we'll see what this looks like when we do this. If we look at inspect our console log, we should at the very least see in the console that all the data is there, which is great. It's working, but our component is not rendering. So we need to make an adjustment here. Inside of our component here, instead of console logging, because we know that is working, we could then use our hook to set data and set it as the payload coming back. Now let me look at this here. So if I refresh, nothing happened, right? Did the network request even get called? It did. So let's see here. In fact, I'm in an infinite loop here, which is not good because now we're in a situation where it's calling many times. This is not good for us. Why? Because this is just, we're in an infinite loop now. So we need to control this now because we can crash our browser. And this is one of the reasons that these lifecycle hooks are so good, because what happens here is we were calling it in the function, and it would, when on first load, it'll fetch the data, update state. React will then re-render. This will get called again, set state, re-render. So we were in an infinite loop, and it was infinitely calling, which is not what we want. We want to call this one time and one time only when the component loads up. So that's where the useEffect hook comes into play. So useEffect can act as, has two purposes. You can use it one time when the component mounts, it fires, which is a great time to call it because everything's rendered and then we know the component is ready. Call it one time. Or you can also fire it when something updates. And that's something that took me a little while to understand. So useEffect takes a callback, or we could just plug in that message that we created, fetch data. And because we want to run it one time, there's a dependency array that will leave empty. So when you leave this array empty, that is working. It is working as if this whole hook right now is working like the component did mount hook from the functional component. The class component. So let's look at this here. Refresh. you can see that it made the post, and we can inspect that, and it's outputting the post data. Now I made a mistake with two things. I just looked at my code. What I needed to do was in my data map, I needed to return the value for the new array. That was not happening, as well as I was kind of passing this by reference into the useEffect, whereas I needed to pass it in this way. So a little syntax thing always with JavaScript, it's always very finicky. But anyhow, the dependency array is empty. That means it'll fire one time. If for some reason we were tracking some other flag, I don't want to put data in there because that'll create an infinite effect, an infinite loop. But let's just say we had some other mechanism like show data that could be true or false. This will actually fire when that dependency changes. So we can actually make useEffect work and cause side effects, either by one of its dependencies changing, or if we just want it to load one time, we can have it to load one time. We could also use multiple useEffects in our code, which is another thing that's a little bit strange. So we have one that acts as a component mount, and we could have one acting as if it is the component did update, which is a hook from class components, and we would be tracking another dependency. So for now, this is all working. This is what we want. And if we just quickly compare it to the class component, you can see, again, just this is what it looks like in a class component. A little bit longer again. It has extending from React component. It has super constructor. And the constructor, there's this keyword. Now we're tracking post as an array. In our JSX, we are using the map, but we need to set it up digging into this .state. Same setup there. This is the hook that we're mimicking, the lifecycle hook called component mount, and then everything else is the same. The only thing that is different, again, is instead of using set data directly, we have to wrap it in this function that is provided from React class components for this .set state. So to recap, just a lot easier to use React 18 with hooks. It makes your life so much nicer, and you have very nice code to work with. Out of the box, you can create a functional component to work like a class component, and that's more modern React. And as we start delving deeper into that, you'll learn more to help you with your React development.